What if I told you that right now, near the ports and coastlines of the Middle East, along the routes carrying oil, grain, steel, and goods for the entire world, huge cargo ships are sitting idle? But they're not damaged, they're not sheltering from bad weather, and they're not off course. They've simply been abandoned. But the most terrifying part isn't that a ship worth millions of dollars is rusting somewhere offshore. The most terrifying part is that people are still living inside it. These aren't passengers, they're crew members who were supposed to deliver the cargo, collect their wages, and return home. Instead, they've been left trapped inside a steel hull that no one wants anymore and that they can't simply walk away from. A sailor aboard an abandoned vessel off the coast of Yemen wrote that there was no food, no water, and no life left on board. On another ship in Kuwait, the crew went on hunger strike and several sailors had to be hospitalized. On a tanker off the coast of the UAE, one man couldn't take it anymore after spending 13 months on board. This isn't a story about a delayed shipment. It's a story about how global trade can leave people trapped inside a ship while the owner disappears, the port waits for a decision, and the flag state remains silent. Why does the ship keep floating while the people trapped on board suffer in appalling conditions? And why does no one seem to care? Well, I do. In 2023, more than 2,000 seafarers aboard roughly 150 vessels were abandoned. At the time, it was the highest figure recorded in the 20 years since the UN agencies responsible for labor and maritime transport began tracking such cases. Compared with the situation just 10 years earlier, the problem had clearly grown much worse. The number of abandoned vessels surged during the global pandemic and never bounced back to its previous level. And vessel abandonment isn't confined to a single region or a handful of notoriously bad ports where crews simply happen to be unlucky. Seafarers were abandoned aboard a floating fish processing factory off the coast of Angola. They were stranded on an icebreaker in the Netherlands. They were left without food or fuel in Istanbul. The problem doesn't end in the Middle East, Africa, or Asia. Even the United States, which has some of the strictest maritime regulations in the world, hasn't been immune. 2 vessels were abandoned there in 2022 as well. But the hardest part is that the seafarers can't simply sit aboard the vessel and wait. They're forced to keep working because the ship still has to be maintained. The owner may have disappeared, the wages may have stopped coming, and assistance may be stuck somewhere between different countries and government agencies, but the vessel's still a vessel. It has to be looked after. It can't simply be left unattended because otherwise it could become a danger to everything around it. Meanwhile, conditions on board are often almost prison-like. The food's as basic and inexpensive as possible. For example, a meager diet of rice and dal supplied by charities in the Indian consulate. The exact food may vary from place to place, but the reality's the same. People are forced to survive on whatever they can somehow obtain. Contact with the outside world is limited as well. Sometimes Wi-Fi is only available aboard another ship, which means the crew can't properly contact their families or even try to seek help. It's utterly hopeless, and sometimes the crew doesn't even have clean drinking water. In those cases, the seafarers have to purify seawater just to survive. And that raises a very simple question. Why don't they just pack their things and go home? Because for a seafarer, it's often not as simple as walking away from a bad job. By the time a vessel's abandoned, a crew member may already have spent months and sometimes years working on board. During that time, the ship owner will usually have built up a substantial amount of unpaid wages, and the sailors understand that if they leave the ship voluntarily and return home, they may never see that money. Besides, leaving isn't always that easy. If someone hasn't been paid for months, they may simply have no money for the trip home. Another problem is that once a sailor leaves the vessel, recovering those unpaid wages becomes much more difficult. As long as the crew member remains on board, they retain a maritime claim against the ship. Put simply, the ship itself is a leverage that can be used to recover the debt. But once the sailor leaves the vessel, that leverage may disappear, and they may never get paid. For many of them, returning home without their wages would be devastating. It could destroy the entire family financially. Many sailors and their relatives take out large loans to pay recruitment fees and cover the costs of securing the job in the first place. In other words, people don't go to sea because life is going well. They go because their families have already invested everything in that opportunity. And while the sailor remains trapped on an abandoned ship, things aren't going well back home either. Children grow up without their fathers, sometimes going several years without seeing them instead of the expected 6 months. The family also has to survive without a major source of income, which leads to mounting debts, more loans, and the sale of their last valuables. In a situation like that, abandoning the ship and returning home empty-handed simply isn't an option. And these cases usually aren't resolved in a week or two. In most instances, sailors remain stranded on abandoned vessels for 5 to 8 months. Just think about that. A person leaves home for a voyage, expecting to complete a contract and return to their family, and instead they spend almost an entire year trapped between the ship, the port, the owner, and the laws of a foreign country. But even that wasn't the worst of it. In some countries, weak regulations allowed dishonest ship owners to drag these situations out for far longer. Crews could remain without pay, fuel, or adequate supplies not for months, but for years, sometimes for as long as a decade. But abandoned crews were never a problem affecting sailors alone. They damaged the entire shipping industry. The director of the International Chamber of Shipping said that such unscrupulous behavior tarnished the reputation of the entire industry, and that created problems even for reputable companies that didn't abandon their crews and tried to operate responsibly. Because how do you persuade someone to go to sea after they've seen stories like these? When they know they could leave home for work, become stranded on a ship without pay, proper food, or a way home, and then spend months waiting for someone, somewhere, to decide who's responsible for them? Naturally, responsible shipping companies are finding it increasingly difficult to recruit workers. According to forecasts from the International Chamber of Shipping, the industry could face a serious labor shortage in 2026, around 96,000 workers. And that's in an industry that previously employed around 2 million people. But here's the most insane part. Sometimes sailors were abandoned without even being stranded at sea. In some cases, a crew member would go ashore because of a medical emergency, only to discover that the ship owner wasn't the only thing that could suddenly disappear. The ship itself could disappear too. In one case, a sailor was severely injured in an accident aboard a vessel. A crane loading cargo onto the ship tipped sideways, causing the vessel to capsize, and the man lost his leg. He was rushed to a hospital for surgery. Another crew member went with him, simply to make sure he wasn't left there alone, and while they were both at the hospital, the ship just sailed away without them. The two men were left with no money and none of their belongings. The second sailor, who'd only come along to support his injured crewmate, was forced to eat scraps left behind by other patients because the hospital wouldn't provide him with meals and he had no money to buy food. They were stranded alone in Iran, with almost no one to turn to for help. There was little hope of ever receiving their wages either. The ship was gone, the employer had disappeared, and with them went the crew's last remaining source of leverage. Eventually, the two men somehow managed to get by and return home, but they were never paid. What could possibly be worse than that? Pirates. I found out that sailors are sometimes simply abandoned in pirate captivity. One of the most harrowing cases involved the Panamanian-flagged vessel MV Iceberg 1. On March 29, 2010, it was attacked and seized by pirates. They did what pirates do, took the crew hostage and demanded a ransom, but then the sailors were unexpectedly left to fend for themselves. The company that owned the ship went bankrupt and was unable to pay the pirates anything. And because of that, the crew remained in captivity for almost 3 years. They were finally rescued only after maritime police stormed the vessel and freed them by force. Afterward, the sailors required medical treatment. Many of them had suffered serious physical injuries. And this was far from an isolated horror story. In 2010, the piracy crisis became so severe that, at any given moment, more than 600 people were being held hostage. The conditions were horrific. People were treated like animals and, according to one account, were forced to eat rats. Sailors frequently died in captivity, while many of those who survived developed severe psychological problems after spending months as hostages. But even when pirates leave an abandoned vessel alone, and even when there's still food and water aboard, it can still turn into a trap. That's what happened to the MV Selenova. The crew was left without electricity, Wi-Fi, working refrigerators, GPS, safety systems, or emergency lighting. They were only about 15 miles from shore, close, but still completely trapped. The ship was dangerously low on fuel, and as the fuel ran out, so did the food, fresh water, and medicine. And just when it seemed like almost everything that could go wrong already had, the sea apparently decided the crew hadn't suffered enough. A storm rolled in and the ship couldn't weigh anchor, reach a proper port, and waited out there. There was no fuel, so it simply remained at anchor. The crew could do nothing but wait, knowing that if the weather became too severe, if a full-blown hurricane struck, the ship could be torn from its anchorage and swept out into the open sea, and then no one would ever find them. Fortunately, this story appears to have ended well, but the danger was still very real, and it remains just as real for every ship abandoned to its fate. Sometimes, however, ships are abandoned in the middle of an active war zone, and that's unquestionably worse than any storm. That's what happened to the tanker Nathan. Its crew was left stranded for 3 months after a dispute broke out between the ship's owners. For the 15 crew members from India, Egypt, and Turkey, those 3 months were filled with constant tension. They often spent sleepless nights listening to distant explosions, the sound of Russian airstrikes, and Ukrainian air defenses. Then one day, a drone exploded right beside the ship. The blast waved through one of the crew members backward. After that, explosions kept erupting around the tanker. The crew had nowhere to go, and no one was willing to take responsibility for them. Without permission from the port or immigration authorities, they couldn't leave the ship. What was supposed to be a short cargo delivery run turned into a months-long nightmare. And sometimes the story of an abandoned ship stops being just a story about a ship. Remember the explosion that rocked Beirut in August 2020? A massive stockpile of cargo exploded at the port. At least 218 people were killed, around 7,000 were injured, roughly 300,000 were forced from their homes, and the property damage was estimated at $15 billion. And this incident had a direct connection to abandoned vessels. Had it not been for one such ship, the explosion might have been avoided altogether. But let's start from the beginning. On September 23, 2013, the MV Rosas departed from the port of Batumi, Georgia. Its final destination was the city of Beirut in Mozambique, where it was supposed to deliver roughly 2,750 tons of cargo. But something went wrong along the way. The ship was fairly old. It had been built in 1986, and although its hull had been modified, the vessel still suffered damage during the voyage. In the end, the Rosas entered the port of Beirut for repairs, but it never left. From that point on, though, the story becomes extremely murky. According to one version, the Rosas didn't end up in Beirut solely because it needed repairs. The ship's owner was also facing financial difficulties. The captain later said he'd been told to pick up an additional load of heavy machinery to raise enough money to pay for passage through the Suez Canal, but the equipment proved too heavy to load. Then the ship's owner failed to pay the port fees and fines, so the Lebanese authorities seized the vessel along with its cargo. According to lawyers involved in the case, the owners soon simply abandoned the Rosas because everyone had lost interest in both the ship and its cargo. And while all of this dragged on, the crew remained trapped on board. They were running out of food and supplies. In other words, it was a textbook case of vessel abandonment. The owner disappeared, the cargo became stranded, the ship remained stuck in port, and the people on board could do nothing but wait for someone to decide their fate. Now let's return to the cargo. What exactly was the Rosas carrying? Roughly 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, the very same material that later exploded at the port after being unloaded and stored there following the ship's seizure. So abandoned vessels aren't only a problem for the sailors left on board. Had this entire chain of events never begun, had the ship not become stranded in Beirut, had its owner not vanished, the cargo might simply have continued along its route and reached its original destination. In that case, 218 people might still be alive, and the horrific destruction might have been avoided. And this finally brings us to the main question: why do owners abandon their ships in the first place? For ship owners, keeping the vessel simply becomes too expensive because of rising fuel costs, mounting debts, or the need for major repairs. That's really all it takes. Sometimes owners promise they'll settle what they owe once their financial situation improves, but for the crew, those promises change nothing. They remain stranded on board without pay, with no idea when or if those promises will ever turn into actual money. Many abandoned vessels were also in poor condition to begin with. They were barely seaworthy and usually operated on less profitable routes. In other words, these weren't grand ships owned by major corporations where every problem could be quickly handled by lawyers and insurance companies. They often belonged to small operators, some of them working in the gray area of the law. And for them, even a minor financial setback can set off a chain of problems they may never recover from. Eventually, the owner reaches a cynical conclusion: saving the ship would cost more than abandoning it. So they walk away from the vessel and leave the crew behind with it. But if all of this is illegal, if people are abandoned without pay, food, or any way to return home, why aren't the owners always punished? The problem is that the true ship owner is often hidden behind a complicated network of companies registered in different countries, and once an investigation begins, it quickly becomes clear that locating the ship is much easier than figuring out who's actually responsible for it. A vessel may be registered under a flag of convenience in one country. Remember that term, because we'll come back to flags of convenience a little later. The owner may be based in one country, the management company may be registered in another. On paper, everything appears to be in order. There's a flag, documentation, a company, and contracts, but the moment someone has to determine who's responsible for paying the crew and bringing them home, the entire structure begins to fall apart. Because responsibilities spread so thinly, police and courts in different countries often can't quickly agree on who's supposed to intervene. And while they argue over jurisdiction, the crew remains trapped on board. In theory, international regulations require the owner either pay the crew or arrange for their repatriation. So the system does know what's supposed to happen, but in fact, avoiding responsibility is far too easy. Now let's look at the geography of the problem. Yes, I started by saying that this is an international issue, and that's true. But some regions are clearly more dangerous than others. In fact, 2025 was the worst year in the history of modern shipping. 6,223 seafarers aboard 410 vessels were abandoned and left to fend for themselves. That's roughly 30% more than in 2024. So where exactly is this happening? The Middle East is considered the worst region in terms of the number of abandoned vessels. Europe's close behind. And when we look at individual countries, two stand out more than any others. Turkey with 61 abandoned vessels and the United Arab Emirates with 54. So yes, the problem is global, but its most prominent hotspots aren't somewhere on the outer edges of the maritime world. They're right next to major ports, shipping routes, and countries that handle the daily flow of global commerce. But surely the sheer volume of maritime traffic can't be the reason, or can it? When it comes to the UAE, the explanation's fairly straightforward. It's one of the world's key logistics hubs for shipping companies. The country's ports receive around 21,000 vessels a year, while more than 20,000 local and international maritime companies operate across the UAE. In other words, an enormous flow of ships, companies, cargo, and money passes through the country. It's a major center not only for maritime trade, but also for the registration of shipping companies. So one reason seafarers were abandoned in the UAE more often is simply that so many ships pass through its ports. The greater the traffic, the more cases like these you're likely to see. But scale isn't the only factor. Experts believe the maritime industry in the UAE isn't regulated strictly enough. The lack of proper oversight means that more and more seafarers are finding themselves stranded and in desperate circumstances. The UAE has, of course, made attempts to address the problem by changing its laws and regulations, but meaningful change still appears to be a long way off. The country still hasn't ratified the International Labor Organization's Maritime Labor Convention. So what more is there to say? Turkey, however, is a completely different story. As of the end of 2013, the average age of the Turkish fleet was 25 years, and 66% of its vessels were more than 20 years old. In other words, Turkey had and still has a large number of aging ships. And for an owner, an old vessel isn't simply a form of transportation that generates revenue, it's also a source of mounting future expenses. It needs more frequent repairs and maintenance, and once the owner's had enough, it has to be sold, scrapped, or somehow taken out of service. It's a whole lot of trouble. But if operating a vessel like this suddenly becomes unprofitable, it's often easier for the owner to simply abandon the ship, and the crew along with it. And that's exactly what many of them do. But if we stop looking at the ports and turn to the human side of the problem, seafarers from a few particular countries bear the brunt of it. In 2025, just as in 2024, Indian seafarers were the most severely affected group. A total of 1,125 were abandoned. Filipino seafarers came in second with 539 cases. Next came Syrians with 309 abandoned sailors. So what's going on with India? Well, first of all, there are simply a lot of Indian seafarers. Indian citizens make up roughly 10% of the world's seafaring workforce. More than 200,000 Indians work aboard the global merchant fleet, and the more people a country has working at sea, the greater the statistical likelihood that some of them will end up aboard a troubled vessel. But there's also a second reason. For many aspiring seafarers from India's poorer regions, a job at sea seems like their only chance to escape poverty. To pursue that opportunity, people take out large loans or even put up their property as collateral to pay illegal recruitment agents. And that's when the trap snaps shut. These middlemen place them aboard financially unstable vessels using forged contracts. In other words, ships that are already at high risk of running into trouble. Seafarers, as well as industry experts, have frequently criticized the Indian authorities for failing to regulate this sector strictly enough. And it wasn't until the end of 2025 that the Indian government finally began taking serious action and properly protecting its citizens. Better late than never. But there's another crucial part of this system: flags. Remember when I said we'd come back to them? At first, it may sound strange. Why should the flag a ship sails under matter at all? There's a vessel, an owner, and a crew. But in the maritime industry, a flag isn't just an image flying from the stern. It represents the country that's formally responsible for the ship. Vessels flying so-called flags of convenience account for a large share of abandoned ships. In 2025, 337 vessels sailing under these flags were abandoned, 82% of the total. Panama had the largest number of abandoned ships, 68, compared with 43 the year before. Meanwhile, the number of abandoned vessels sailing under an unknown flag more than doubled, rising from 20 to 46. I should probably explain what a flag of convenience actually is. Every ship must be registered in a country, even if it spends most of its time operating in international waters. That country's known as the flag state. Legally, the flag state's responsible for ensuring that the ship owner follows safety standards and treats the crew properly. But a ship sailing under a flag of convenience is registered in a country other than the one where its owner is based. And for ship owners who care more about profits than sailors, this arrangement can be extremely attractive. Registering a vessel under a flag of convenience often means low fees and equally low taxes. Sometimes there are no taxes at all. After that, many owners decide they can cut costs even further. They hire the cheapest labor available, pay the lowest possible wages, and slash spending on their crew's welfare. So a flag of convenience has absolutely nothing to do with making life more convenient for the crew. It benefits only those who want to make a ship cheaper to operate. And the moment that kind of vessel requires serious investment, repairs for example, the owner suddenly loses interest. Why spend the money when it's easier to replace it with another ship? And the people are simply left behind, unfortunately. You owe me a like. See you later.